For Joshua Evans, every airplane was a promise of a future where he could soar beyond all doubt. But when he got too close to the dream at Carver City Airport, the adult world responded with sirens and suspicions staining his skin. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. Joshua Evans never talked much, not even when excitement burned inside him like a jet engine roaring to life. At 14 years old, he preferred sketching planes over chasing friends across the cracked asphalt of Carver City Middle School's playground. His bedroom walls shimmered with pencil drawings of sleek aircraft, each line tracing his dream of touching the sky someday. When his mother, Dr. Eliza Rivers, mentioned a weekend trip to Carver Regional Airport, something electric sparked behind his dark brown eyes. She'd promised he could see the planes up close, a rare treat after months of canceled plans due to her demanding job. Dr. Rivers ran the National Aviation Service, a title Joshua barely understood beyond the way it made her voice sharpen on work calls. That Saturday morning, he pulled on a faded blue hoodie and jeans, his sneakers scuffing the floor as he grabbed a sketchbook. His mother kissed his forehead, her words steady and warm, encouraging him to soak in every detail of the day ahead. The drive to the airport felt endless, sunlight slicing through the windshield as Joshua pressed his face against the glass. He imagined the hum of propellers, the rush of takeoff, the way pilots must feel invincible behind those controls. When they arrived, Dr. Rivers parked near the small terminal, her NAS badge clipped to her blazer, catching the light. She'd arranged a quick tour with a friend who worked there, nothing formal, just a chance for Joshua to see what he loved most. They stepped onto the tarmac, the air thick with fuel and promise, and Joshua's heart thudded louder than the distant engines. He followed her toward a row of light aircraft, his eyes locking on a sleek Aerohawk 200, its silver body gleaming under the noon sun. His mother paused to chat with a staff member, her voice fading as Joshua's curiosity pulled him forward. He didn't mean to wander far, just a few steps to get a better angle on the plane's sharp wings. His fingers itched to trace the curves he'd drawn 100 times, though he kept them stuffed in his pockets instead. He stood there, lost in the machine's quiet power, imagining himself flipping switches in the cockpit someday. Across the tarmac, inside a weathered pilot's lounge, Will Harper squinted through the window, his coffee cooling in his grip. At 58, he'd flown cargo planes for decades, his instincts honed by years of spotting trouble before it bloomed. Something about the boy lingering near his Aerohawk twisted his gut. Not a clear threat, just a hunch he couldn't shake. He set the mug down, his weathered hand reaching for his radio, voice low as he called security about a kid too close to the planes. Minutes later, 2 guards in stiff gray uniforms approached Joshua, their boots heavy against the pavement, breaking his daydream with sharp questions. He blinked up at them, his voice small but steady, explaining he was just looking because he loved planes more than anything. They didn't smile, their radios crackling as one stepped aside to call for backup, citing protocol about unattended minors near restricted zones. Joshua's chest tightened, his sketchbook suddenly heavy in his hands, as he wondered how staring at a plane had turned into this. Joshua Evans stood frozen on the sun-warmed tarmac, his sneakers rooted to the ground as the security guards loomed over him. Their voices carried a clipped edge, asking why he'd strayed from his mother, what he was doing so close to the Aerohawk 200. He clutched his sketchbook tighter, his words tumbling out in a rush, explaining how he only wanted to see the plane's wings up close. The guards exchanged a quick glance, their faces unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses, as if his love for aviation didn't register as a valid reason. One muttered into his radio, calling for police assistance, his tone suggesting Joshua's presence alone was enough to raise alarms. Across the pavement, Dr. Eliza Rivers turned from her conversation, her sharp eyes catching the scene unfolding near her son. Her stomach dropped, a familiar dread creeping in, the kind she'd felt too many times as a black woman in spaces not built for her. Will Harper stepped outside the lounge, his arms crossed tight against his chest, watching the guards question Joshua with a frown etched deep into his weathered face. He'd flown planes through storms and landed on runways slick with ice, but something about this kid sparked unease he couldn't name. His call to security hadn't been personal, just a reflex from years of guarding what he saw as his territory. Yet now, seeing Joshua's small frame flanked by uniforms, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him, though he pushed it down fast. The boy's quiet answers, soft, polite, tinged with confusion, didn't match the threat Will's mind had conjured, but he stood firm anyway. Doctor. Rivers strode toward them, her heels clicking with purpose, her NAS badge glinting like a shield as she closed the distance. Police sirens wailed faintly, growing louder as a cruiser screeched to a stop near the fence, tires grinding against the curb with unnecessary force. Officer Daniel Voss climbed out, adjusting his belt with a swagger that suggested he'd already decided the story before hearing it. He approached Joshua, towering over the boy, his voice booming as he demanded to know where his parents were and why he was near the plane. Joshua pointed toward his mother, his hand trembling slightly, explaining he was with her and hadn't touched anything at all. Voss barely glanced at Dr. Rivers, his focus locked on Joshua, asking again if he had ID, as if a 14-year-old carried a wallet on a Saturday outing. The question hung heavy, laced with an assumption that Joshua didn't belong, his brown skin a silent mark against him in Voss's eyes. Doctor. Rivers reached them, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, announcing she was his mother and demanding to know what was happening. Voss turned, his eyebrows lifting slightly, but his posture didn't soften, his tone still edged with suspicion as he asked who she was. She pulled her NAS credentials from her blazer, holding them up with a calm that masked the storm brewing inside her. The gold lettering, Doctor. Eliza Rivers, National Aviation Service, silenced Voss for a moment, his confidence faltering as he processed her authority. Will Harper shifted his weight, his arms uncrossing, suddenly aware he'd misread more than just the boy's intentions. Joshua looked up at his mother, relief washing over him, though the sting of being seen as trouble lingered in his chest. Eliza Rivers stood beside her son, her hand resting lightly on Joshua's shoulder as she faced Officer Daniel Voss with unflinching resolve. Her NAS credentials dangled from her fingers, the gold lettering catching the sunlight, a quiet testament to her power over the skies above Carver City. Voss blinked hard, his jaw tightening as he struggled to recalibrate the scene unfolding before him, clearly unprepared for a black woman to wield such authority. He stammered slightly, asking what her role meant, his tone shifting from accusation to unease as he glanced back at Joshua. Doctor. Rivers didn't raise her voice, her words deliberate and piercing, questioning why her son's curiosity warranted police surrounding him like a criminal. She pointed out the obvious, her gaze flicking to Will Harper, noting how a white kid might have gotten a smile instead of sirens. Joshua stayed quiet, his eyes darting between his mother and the adults, his sketchbook pressed against his chest like a shield. He'd seen shows where people got questioned, but feeling it himself carved a hollow ache he couldn't name yet. Will shuffled closer, his boots scuffing the pavement, his voice gruff as he tried to explain he'd only meant to protect his plane. Doctor. Rivers turned to him, her expression sharpening, asking if he'd ever considered Joshua might dream of flying that Arrowhawk instead of stealing it. Will's face flushed, his defense faltering under her steady stare, his decades of experience suddenly feeling flimsy against her clarity. The guards stepped back, their radios silent now, sensing the tide shifting as Doctor. Rivers dismantled the situation with every measured sentence. Voss tried to regain control, his hand resting on his belt, suggesting they'd followed protocol for unattended kids near restricted zones. Doctor. Rivers cut him off, her voice rising just enough to carry over the distant hum of engines, pointing out Joshua wasn't unattended, he was with her, a fact they'd ignored. She asked again, her tone flat but loaded, whether they'd have called backup if Joshua's skin were lighter, his hair blonder. The question landed like a punch, Voss's lips parting with no answer, his certainty crumbling under the weight of her implication. Will rubbed his neck, his eyes dropping to the ground, the unease he'd buried now clawing its way to the surface as he faced his own role. Joshua watched his mother, her strength anchoring him, though the sting of being singled out burned deeper than he'd admit. Doctor. Rivers crouched briefly, checking if Joshua was okay, her hand brushing his cheek as he nodded with a small, shaky smile. She stood again, her presence towering despite her average height, informing Voss, and while this wasn't over, they'd hear from her office soon. The threat hung in the air, not loud but unshakable, promising a reckoning beyond this tarmac standoff. Voss muttered an apology, his words half-hearted, while Will stayed silent, his arms hanging limp, the weight of his mistake settling in. Doctor. Rivers guided Joshua away, her hand firm on his back, leaving the men to stew in the silence of their misjudgment as the airport buzzed on around them. Joshua Evans walked beside his mother, his sneakers dragging slightly against the pavement as they left the tarmac behind, heading toward their car. Doctor. Eliza Rivers kept her hand on his shoulder, her touch steadying him, though her silence spoke louder than the fading hum of the airport around them. He glanced back once, catching Will Harper's hunched figure still standing near the Aerohawk, the pilot's face shadowed with something Joshua couldn't read. The boy's chest felt tight, his love for planes now tangled with the bitter taste of being seen as trouble instead of a dreamer. Doctor. Rivers unlocked the car, her movements sharp, her jaw set as she processed the sting of watching her son treated like a threat. Inside the vehicle, Joshua stared out the window, his sketchbook resting unopened on his lap, his fingers tracing its worn edges absently. He wanted to ask his mother why those men looked at him that way, why his skin seemed to shout danger when all he'd done was admire playing. Doctor. Rivers caught his expression in the rearview mirror, her voice softening as she told him he'd done nothing wrong, that some people see shadows where there's only light. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles paling, her mind replaying Officer Voss's dismissive tone and Will's quick judgment. She'd fought those same assumptions in boardrooms, her success a shield she'd hoped would protect Joshua too, but today proved it wasn't enough. Back at the airport, Will Harper lingered near his plane, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, the weight of Doctor. Rivers's words pressing down like a storm cloud he couldn't outfly. He'd spent decades trusting his gut, priding himself on spotting risks before they grew, but now he wondered how often he'd misjudged kids like Joshua. The boy's quiet passion, clear in his stance, his wide-eyed stare, clashed with the threat Will had imagined, exposing a bias he'd never named until today. He kicked a loose pebble, his thoughts churning, the image of Doctor. Rivers's badge and her piercing question about blonde hair looping in his mind. He'd meant no harm, he told himself, but the excuse felt hollow against the memory of Joshua's confusion. Officer Voss drove away, his cruiser rumbling down the airport road, his radio crackling with routine calls as he tried to shake the encounter from his head. He'd followed protocol, he reasoned, his training drilled to treat unknowns as risks, but Doctor. Rivers's challenge gnawed at him. Would he have called backup for a white kid in the same spot? The question stuck, unanswerable, his certainty fraying as he pictured Joshua's small frame against the plane, harmless yet framed as trouble. Back home, Joshua sat on his bed, his sketches spread out, his mother's voice echoing that he belonged in the sky despite what others thought. Doctor. Rivers watched him from the doorway, her resolve hardening, knowing this moment would shape him, and her fight, more than either of them could yet see. Doctor. Eliza Rivers sat at her kitchen table the next morning, her coffee cooling untouched as she stared at her phone, plotting her next move. Joshua slept upstairs, his sketchbook tucked under his pillow, the weight of yesterday still clinging to his dreams despite her efforts to shield him. She'd spent the night replaying the airport standoff, her anger simmering beneath a resolve to turn this into something bigger than one boy's humiliation. Her role at the National Aviation Service gave her leverage, a platform she'd earned through years of battling doubts about her place in a white man's world. She dialed her deputy, her voice steady but fierce, ordering a review of Carver Regional's security protocols and a meeting with local staff. This wasn't just about Joshua, it was about every kid like him, judged before they could even spread their wings. Downstairs, Joshua shuffled into the kitchen, his hoodie swallowing his small frame, his eyes searching his mother's face for answers she hadn't yet given. She pulled him into a hug, her arms tight, promising he'd never feel out of place in the spaces he loved, not if she could help it. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper, asking if those men would get in trouble for treating him like that. Doctor. Rivers hesitated, her heart aching, explaining some lessons take time, but she'd make sure they learned something from this. She saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes, the unfairness of being targeted for his skin sinking deeper, and vowed to channel her fury into action he could see. At Carver Regional Airport, Will Harper arrived early, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the lounge, his mind still churning from Doctor. Rivers's words about blonde hair and freckles. He'd avoided mirrors all morning, afraid of what he'd see in his own reflection, a man who'd let fear paint a child as a threat without evidence. His radio buzzed with a message for management, summoning him to a meeting about the incident. Doctor. Rivers's name attached like a warning he couldn't ignore. He slumped into a chair, his pride warring with guilt, knowing he'd sparked this mess with a call he couldn't take back. The memory of Joshua's quiet love for planes haunted him, a stark contrast to the suspicion he'd unleashed, rooted in a bias he'd never questioned until now. Later that day, Dr. Rivers strode into the airport's small conference room, her presence commanding silence from Will, Officer Voss, and a nervous security chief fidgeting with his tie. She laid out her demands, no excuses, no platitudes, insisting they retrain staff to spot curiosity, not color, as the first sign of danger. Voss shifted uncomfortably, his apology stilted, claiming he'd meant no harm, but Dr. Rivers shut him down, asking how many black kids he'd questioned that month alone. Will spoke up, his voice rough, admitting he'd been wrong, offering to mentor kids like Joshua to prove he could change. Dr. Rivers studied him, her gaze unrelenting, agreeing only if he followed through, not for her, but for the boy he'd misjudged. Joshua Evans stood on the tarmac 2 weeks later, his hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets, his breath catching as he stared at the Aerohawk 200 gleaming under the morning sun. Dr. Eliza Rivers lingered nearby, her arms crossed, her eyes tracking Will Harper as he approached with a hesitant nod and a flight log tucked under his arm. She'd pushed the National Aviation Service to fund this moment, a private lesson for Joshua, after Will's shaky promise to mentor kids he'd once misjudged. The air buzzed with tension, the memory of flashing sirens and harsh voices still clinging to this patch of Carver Regional Airport. Joshua glanced at his mother, her steady gaze giving him courage, though his heart raced with a mix of excitement and lingering hurt. Will knelt slightly, meeting Joshua's eyes, his voice rough but earnest as he apologized again, admitting he'd seen a shadow where a pilot stood waiting to be born. He handed Joshua a headset, his weathered fingers trembling, explaining they'd take the Aerohawk up together, a short flight to show what the sky really felt like. Joshua nodded, his lips parting in a small, cautious smile, the weight of being feared lifting just enough to let his dream breathe again. Dr. Rivers watched, her jaw tight, knowing this didn't erase the past, but hoping it planted a seed for her son and others like him. She'd fought for this, not just for Joshua, but to crack open a world that too often locked out kids with his skin. The plane's engine roared to life, vibrating through Joshua's chest as he climbed into the co-pilot's seat, his hands hovering over the controls while Will settled beside him. They taxied down the runway, the world blurring past, and when the wheels lifted off, Joshua's breath hitched, his eyes wide with wonder as Carver City shrank below. Will pointed out the altimeter, his tone softer now, teaching Joshua how to read the sky, his own guilt easing with every question the boy asked. Up here, the assumptions that had grounded them both felt distant, the horizon stretching wide enough to hold Joshua's ambitions without judgment. He imagined himself flying solo someday, the sting of that awful day fading against the rush of this new height. Back on the ground, Dr. Rivers waited, her phone buzzing with NAS updates about new outreach programs she'd forced through, classes for kids in underfunded schools, led by pilots like Will who'd learned the hard way. She smiled faintly as the Aerohawk touched down, Joshua's face alight with a joy she hadn't seen since before the incident, his sketchbook already open to capture this flight. Will climbed out, his shoulders lighter, offering Joshua a handshake and a quiet promise to keep teaching if he'd keep learning. Dr. Rivers nodded at Will, her voice firm, telling him this was his chance to undo the damage, not just for her son, but for every kid he'd ever doubted. Joshua looked up, his dream unshaken, knowing the sky was his, no matter who tried to pull him down. Joshua Evans sat in his school's cramped library 6 months later, his fingers tapping nervously on a borrowed laptop as he adjusted a flight's simulator's controls. The room buzzed with chatter from a dozen kids sprawled across mismatched chairs, their eyes glued to posters of jets he'd taped up himself. He'd started the Carver Sky Club after that flight with Will Harper, a quiet space where anyone could dream of wings without fear of being stopped. His voice carried a new steadiness, guiding a shy girl through takeoff mechanics, his confidence forged from a day that nearly broke him. Dr. Eliza Rivers had pushed for this too, her National Aviation Service funding trickling in to buy the simulator, ensuring kids like Joshua weren't left grounded by doubt. Outside, the town whispered about the airport incident, the story fading from headlines but lingering in hushed conversations at Carver's diners and gas stations. Joshua felt the stare sometimes, classmates nudging each other, asking if he'd really face down cops just to see a plane. He shrugged them off, his focus locked on the sky, though the memory of Officer Voss's glare still tightened his throat. Doctor. Rivers had taught him to carry that weight differently, her words echoing that his place in aviation wasn't a gift, it was his right. She turned her fury into action, her NAS programs now reaching schools across the state, challenging a system that too often saw black kids as risks instead of potential. Will Harper pulled into the library parking lot, his truck rattling as he climbed out, a stack of old flight manuals tucked under his arm for the club. He'd kept his promise, showing up twice a month to teach, his gruff voice softening each time. He saw Joshua lead with a quiet fire he'd once overlooked. The pilot had changed, his instincts rewired after months of facing kids who defied the shadows he'd cast on them. He'd lost some old friends, pilots who grumbled about woke rules, but gained something heavier. A purpose tied to opening doors he'd once helped shut. Doctor. Rivers met him at the door, her nod curt but warm, acknowledging his effort without absolving the past. Inside, Joshua watched Will explain lift to a boy with braids, the pilot's hands tracing air currents with a care that felt like amends. The room hummed with possibility, kids of all shades asking questions, their dreams untainted by the suspicion Joshua had faced. Doctor. Rivers stood back, her chest swelling with pride, knowing this club, and her son, were rewriting a narrative that had tried to clip his wings. Joshua caught her eye, his smile small but real, whispering he'd fly for every kid who'd been told they didn't belong. The sky stretched wide above Carver, no longer a privilege guarded by fear, but a promise carved out by a boy who refused to be grounded. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up.